John gave me 20 things on 20 different texts to talk about. I'm going to talk about none of them. I just figured out what I'm going to talk about. Since this is the Northeast Leadership Forum, I will talk about some people I know who are leaders. And the question I want to ask as I start this talk is, why are we here? Why are we here? And hopefully I'll be able to finish it at the end with an answer. I grew up in Northeast Dallas, right at the corner of Dallas, Garland, and Mesquite. I lived in the same bedroom with my older brother George for 18 years. We were truly soulmates. We lived in twin beds, if you remember those days, and right across from each other. My brother George was better looking than I was. He was a better football and baseball player than I was, smarter than I was, and had a lot more girlfriends than I did. Anyway, he went to play football at the University of Texas, and he was a good football player. I followed him there, and I played football also at the University of Texas. I played football at the University of Texas in 1969 and 1970 when the Longhorns won 30 straight games, 2 consecutive national championships. I'd like to tell everybody here today at the Northeast Leadership Forum, I was a great football player at the University of Texas. I only had 2 small problems. Number 1, I was too small. Number 2, I was too slow, and the position I played was called the bench. But anyway. But I was on the team. Anyway, about 8 years ago, my beloved brother George was stricken with congestive heart failure. And he was at St. Luke's Hospital in the intensive care unit at Texas Medical Center in Houston. And he was there for 6 weeks in a coma, awaiting a heart transplant. And he was fighting for his life. And I would go down there. I work a lot of hours in retail. I'd go down there at 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, sometimes 12 o'clock at night, sometimes 2 o'clock in the morning. And I would kneel by my brother's bedside and pray. And even though he was in a coma, he knew I was there. We were that close. And quite often as I would be kneeling at his bedside, this man would walk in named Bud Frazier. Bud Frazier at that time was 72 years old. Bud Frazier was trained by Denton Cooley and Michael DeBakey, and has done more heart transplants than anybody in history. Bud Frazier has. He invented the LVAT and HeartMate 2 and all these famous artificial heart devices. And he would come in there at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and he would check my brother's charts, nurture my brother, and then he would talk to me. And I thought it was unbelievable that this guy, who was one of the most famous heart surgeons in the world, would be there checking on his patients at 2 o'clock in the morning. And finally one day the curiosity got the best of me, and I said, Dr. Frazier, what time do you operate in the morning? He said, I operate at 6. I said, it's 2 o'clock now. I said, do you ever get any sleep? He said, yeah, I'll go up to my office and sleep for 3 or 4 hours. I'll be good. I said, do you ever go home? He said, not very often. I said, why are you here? He said, my patients are my life. He said, my patients are my life. There's a woman in Houston named Yvonne Strait. 65 years ago, she gave birth to a child with severe Down syndrome. Back then, the average age expectancy for a child with severe Down syndrome was 6 years old. And Yvonne's father was a doctor at Methodist Hospital. So she took this child to all the specialists in all these different places, and they all said there was no hope for this child, to put her in an institution and let her die. Well, Yvonne's like everybody here today at the Northeast Leadership Forum. She's not a buyer, she's a seller. She wasn't buying that. So she took her child to hundreds of doctors all across Texas, indeed all across the United States, and she always got the same terribly disappointing answer: no hope. Finally, one day she heard about a doctor at Purdue University in Indiana And she had an appointment in the middle of January for her child. And she thought to herself, why am I going to drive all the way up to Indiana in the snow and ice to be disappointed again? But something told her to do it. She drove all the way up there, and the doctor there got her child to make a sound. It was the first sound that child had ever made. And Yvonne understood there was hope for her child. So Yvonne went on to start the Briarwood School in Houston, which is a school for adults with severe learning disabilities. And she also, after her child aged out at age 18 of Briarwood, she started Brookwood, which is a home in Brookshire, Texas for adults with severe learning disabilities, people with Down syndrome, successful business people who have had a car or motorcycle accident and brain trauma. And at Brookwood, they have 99 full-time residents. They take zero government funding. And every resident there has a full-time job. And even the paraplegics have a full-time job because Yvonne, like I do, believes that work is life's greatest therapy. So last year they took in this banker guy who was a big-time executive, had a motorcycle accident, brain trauma. They took him in at Brookwood. He was very reluctant to do any of these jobs they had him do because he was so frustrated with his inability to think anymore. Finally, they got him to do the job, and one day, one Friday afternoon, Yvonne was sitting in her office, and this grown man came running down the hallway with a piece of paper in his hand. It was this guy, John, and he burst in her room, and Yvonne didn't know what was happening, and he's shaking this piece of paper in his hand, and he says, Miss Straight, Miss Straight, Miss Straight, look what I got, look what I got, look what I got. She said, what'd you get, John? He said, Miss Straight, Miss Straight, Miss Straight, I got a paycheck, I got a paycheck, I got a paycheck. I'm a real person now. Yvonne Straight has changed the world when it comes to adults with learning disabilities. She changed the world. Yvonne Straight's 91 years old. 3 months ago, she fell and damaged her head. And because she takes blood thinners, she had a massive stroke. Took her to the hospital and she lost all memory. Yvonne Straight, however, is a life force for good. She willed her memory back in 18 hours. And she had an appointment 4 days later with a major donor at Brookwood. And they told her she had to stay in the hospital for 3 weeks. She's 91 years old. She got up, she got dressed, and drove herself out 100 miles for the appointment. Yvonne Straight is a life force for good. And isn't that what we all should strive to be, a life force for good? I have a daughter named Elizabeth. When she was 13 years old, she was diagnosed with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, Howard Hughes disease, and her mother and I were told she would never graduate from high school. Anyway, Elizabeth has fought her mental illness for years, but she was lucky enough to go to Loyola University, and she met this wonderful woman who was her mentor in the School of Social Work where Liz enrolled. And she asked this lady, why did you get involved in social work? She said, that's a good question. I come from a very wealthy family here in Chicago. She said, in every Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter, my parents would take us to a food kitchen, a soup kitchen, and we would feed the homeless. She said, and I was always very concerned about why we had so much and these homeless people had so little, and that's why I enrolled in the School of Social Work. She said, and throughout my college career, I would always write to Mother Teresa. And she said Mother Teresa would write me back. And she would always put on the bottom of the letter, P.S., you really must come visit us. So after she graduated with an undergraduate degree in social work, she got on an airplane on a whim and flew to Calcutta, India, never knowing if she'd even meet Mother Teresa. And she slept on a cot 8 feet away from Mother Teresa the first night and lived with her for 2 years. And they would go out into the slums of Calcutta and rescue these people who were dying of AIDS and tuberculosis and leprosy and all these terribly contagious diseases. And the medical protocol was you had to wear a mask and gloves so you wouldn't contact the disease. Mother Teresa had one rule: no gloves, no mask, because she wanted these human beings to have the warmth of human touch in their final hours. And nobody ever got sick. And one day Mother Teresa said to her, bring a change of clothes, we're going on a trip. They flew across the world. Next thing she knew, Liz's teacher, who's a tall lady, and Mother Teresa, the diminutive lady, were walking through St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and there was 1 million people there. And there were helicopters there and cameras and people everywhere. They're walking through the basilica, and Mother Teresa looks up at Liz's teacher and says, I don't understand this. What in the world is going on here? What's all the commotion for? Why are all these people here? She said, Mother Teresa, you really don't get it, do you? She said, no, I guess I don't. She said, what's the commotion here for? She said, Mother Teresa, they're here for you. Imagine that, a life built for others. A life built for others. It was September 2nd, 1944, on the USS San Jacinto in the Pacific Ocean. 3 crewmen were to go out that Saturday morning on a mission on their Avenger aircraft. The mission was to fly to Chichi-jima Island and to destroy the Japanese enemy radio tower there. The 3 crewmen knew it was going to be a very difficult task because several of their shipmates had tried to bomb that radio tower the day before, and the anti-aircraft flak drove them away. But they were going to go anyway because it was their duty. It was a clear and sunny day. The pilot was the youngest ever naval pilot. His name was George Herbert Walker Bush. He got in the airplane with his 2 crewmates and they took off. Flying at a 35-degree angle to surface, George Herbert Walker Bush zeroed in on the target. As he flew through the tremendous flak all around him, his airplane was hit by one of the bombs, the shells from the anti-aircraft guns, and he thought to himself, my God, we're going down. This plane is going to blow up. But undaunted, he continued on his mission. He got over the tower and dropped the bombs and damaged part of the tower. He gunned the airplane and roared back out to sea. Now the smoke and fire in the airplane were almost uncontrollable, and he turned the airplane over and he screamed for his 2 crewmates to hit the silk. Hit the silk is Navy parlance, to bail out. The radio wasn't working. He assumed they'd bailed out. He couldn't see in the back of the airplane because of smoke and the fire, and he kept going. And then finally he turned the airplane over for himself to bail out, and he bailed out. The wind propelled George Herbert Walker Bush backward, and he hit his head on the tail of the airplane, deeply gashing his skull and his eye. He pulled the ripcord on his parachute, and only half it opened, and he plunged deep into the ocean, gulping down bitter sea salt water for 20 or 30 feet. Then he fought his way back to the surface. On the surface, all he could see was the Japanese and American planes fighting above him. And he looked frantically around and he couldn't see his 2 crewmates. That's what he was concerned about, his 2 crewmates. Then he saw a life raft that one of the airplanes had dropped about 50 yards away, and he swam to the life raft, inflated it, climbed on it, and the current from the Pacific Ocean was pushing the life raft toward an island where the Japanese were, and that island was famous for cannibalism. Continued looking around, looking for his crewmates, couldn't find them, and that was his major concern. Then he was frantically paddling with his arms, trying to keep away from that Japanese island, all the while vomiting over the side of the raft because of the salt water he'd ingested. After 2 hours, finally, a periscope broke through the Pacific Ocean. It was an American submarine, and George Herbert Walker Bush was rescued. Once he got on the airplane, all he wanted to know was, where are my two crewmates? And he was devastated when he was told there was no sign of them. George Herbert Walker Bush immediately wondered, why me? He wondered, why me? Why am I so lucky to be alive when my two crewmates are dead? Why me? Why did I deserve this? And for the next 74 years of his life, George Herbert Walker Bush got up every morning and wondered, why me? Why was I spared when my two crewmates died? Why me? Why do I have a loving and merciful God who allowed me to live? Why me? Why do I have a wonderful family that loves and supports me? Why me? Why am I fortunate enough to live in the greatest country in the world? Why me? Why am I lucky enough to be in Midland, Texas in the oil business? Why me? Why am I lucky enough to have friends all over the United States and the opportunity provided me by the free enterprise system? Every day of his life, he got up and said, why me? His mother taught him never to whine. He didn't say, why me, like I often do. Why is business bad? Or why did I miss that sale? Or why do I have problems with my kids? Or why didn't my kids make straight A's? He didn't say that. He just said every day, why me? Why am I so lucky to be here? George Herbert Walker Bush set an example for all of us. His mother taught him to just put on a happy face and a positive attitude and to complete his mission every day and to live up to the haunting question of why me? Why am I here? What am I going to do today to earn the right to be on this planet? Why me? Why are all of us lucky enough to live in the great booming economy of Northeast Tarrant County or Harris County in Houston? Why me? We could be in Africa. We could be in Mexico City living on the garbage heap with 10 million other people in a cardboard box. Why me? George Herbert Walker Bush, you see, was the ultimate people person. He grew up in an analog age, not a digital age. If you wanted to be a friend of George Herbert Walker Bush, you know how you befriended him? You met him. My friend Peter Russell was George Bush's press secretary when he was in the White House. And Peter tells a story about how he made an incredible blunder, and many presidents would have fired him for that blunder. And President Bush called for him to come to the Oval Office, and Peter walked in that office. He was all nervous. And George Herbert Walker Bush said, Peter, you'll hit a home run next time. What a guy. What a guy. For the first hour and a half of his life, his adult life, he and Mrs. Bush wrote personal thank you notes every day to people who had done them a favor the day before. I got about 30 of them. George Herbert Walker Bush and Mrs. Bush understood the power of community. They understand that we all have a responsibility for the well-being of our community. George Herbert Walker Bush's life answered the question, why me? Why are we here? We are here to be a life force for good, to have our lives enrich all of our human brothers and sisters, because no matter what color, race, or creed we are all indeed brothers and sisters. George Herbert Walker Bush influenced the human race, and he influenced me forever. And my final question is, why are we here? We are here to realize that life is not about you or me. We are here to realize that life is not about you or me. It's about leaving a legacy of helping people. Leaving a legacy of helping people, communities, and enterprises become better because we were here. Just like the life of George Herbert Walker Bush, Yvonne Strait, Bud Frazier. Thanks very much.